Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Devin Rose. I'm an associate with the Host Broker. And today I'm bringing you a webinar called How to Calculate Adjusted EBITDA for MSPs. This is a topic that we get asked about a lot. It is also something that we see discussed amongst MSP owners frequently on social media. So I wanted to do this webinar today just to help address this topic. And what we're going to do is, first of all, I'm going to tell you why Adjusted EBITDA matters. Then we're going to get into the nitty gritty of the sorts of adjustments that go into it. Then I'm going to walk you through an example of a fictional MSP's profit and loss statement where we do the adjusted EBITDA calculation. Then I'm going to show you how it impacts valuations. So before we get into it, I just want to briefly touch on who the host broker is. We are a brokerage and M&A advisor for IT service providers, and mostly MSPs. If you're a seller, we have a free evaluation available on our website. You can reach out and we will talk to you not only about the metrics that go into valuing your business, but also the more personal aspects of what goes into the selling process and whether it's a good fit for you. If you're an interested buyer, you can register for our mailing list. It is free. It goes out once a week and has all the new opportunities we have for IT service providers for sale. And both of those are available through our website, which is thehostbroker.com. Pictured on the screen is Heartland Ross, who is the founder of the Host Broker, and many of you will be familiar with him. So why calculate adjusted EBITDA? Why does this matter? And the reason why is because adjusted EBITDA, it aims to estimate the earnings that a new owner can expect post-close. So this is a buyer-centric metric. And because it allows buyers to estimate, how much the business is worth to them, it is the most commonly used metric for MSP valuations. Yeah, specifically, we most often see a multiple of adjusted EBITDA. And to give you an idea, for a very small MSP, like a one-man shop, let's say less than a couple $100,000 in revenue per year, the typical multiple that we see is maybe a 2x adjusted EBITDA. And then on the larger side of things, let's say we have an MSP with $10 million a year in revenue, we might see closer to the 8, 9, 10 times multiple of adjusted EBITDA. The biggest factor indeed in determining the multiple is how much revenue the MSP has. But also, there are other variables that go into it. For instance, the amount of recurring revenue, more is better. The size of the geographical target market. Larger markets tend to be valued higher as there's more competition. And of course, the profit margin as well plays into it. And so all those factors go into determining what multiple we would typically see on the market. So the types of adjustments that we'll be looking to make to calculate adjusted EBITDA, first of all, it's revenues that a buyer wouldn't inherit. So we would subtract any non-operating income. We would also subtract any revenues related to the seller's other businesses. So, quite often we see an MSP owner might be running other business expenses through their MSP financials, in which case we adjust for those by subtracting the revenues associated with them. And it's the same for expenses. It's anything that the buyer wouldn't inherit. So, we would add back any expenses related to any other businesses. And then we would also add back personal expenses. So this is a really big one, and we'll go through a bunch of examples. But there's a lot of personal expenses that get added to the P&L, and of course the buyer wouldn't inherit those, so we add those back. And then we also add back any one-time expenses that the buyer wouldn't expect to continue on with on an ongoing basis. We also adjust for the owner's salary. This is because owners of MSPs often don't pay themselves what would be like fair market value. And it goes both ways. Like sometimes the owner is paying themselves a salary that is much higher than market value, but sometimes it's lower too. It really depends on the circumstance. So we add back the owner's salary and then we'll subtract the cost to replace the owner's role at market value to equalize this and to give the buyer a better estimate of the salary associated with that owner's role post close. And I just wanted to have a little bit of a slide here as a cautionary slide. It's really important to be reasonable with these adjustments. There's some gray area with these, and add backs, they increase the adjusted EBITDA, which increases the valuation. So that, is to the benefit of the seller. Um, but you don't want to overdo it because buyers are going to scrutinize these add backs when they're doing their own valuation exercises. And if the seller has included too many add backs or maybe assigned, too much proportion of an add back to a personal expense instead of a business expense, then a buyer is going to push back on that. And the seller is not going to be seen as trustworthy from a buyer's perspective, which is not what you want as you start heading into due diligence. So it's really important to, be you want to have all the reasonable adjustments in there to make sure that the picture is getting painted to a buyer about what the business is going to be worth to them, but not to the extent that you're going to be seen as unreasonable and untrustworthy. So just a word of caution there. So some examples of adjustments that we might typically see on the non-operating income side of things. So this would be revenue from non-core business activities. We might see adjustments for things like government grants, legal settlements, insurance proceeds, rental income. For instance, if some office space is being subleased, sale of assets that aren't related to the core business, and also any investment income. Some examples of adjustments for revenues and expenses from other businesses. So again, this is if the seller has multiple businesses included in their financials. The revenues associated with the other businesses are subtracted, and then the expenses are added back, and that equalizes things. Some examples of personal expenses that we might see. Travel, this is a common one. And this one's a little bit tricky, and this goes back to where there's a gray area. Let's say, for instance, that the MSP owner is traveling to a conference or a client site, and then they tack on a vacation after the business reason for the trip and turn it into a personal vacation. At that point, you do want to be reasonable and not add back the entire trip. You would want to allocate at least a proportion of the expense to as a personal expense, but a portion as a business expense, and add back only the personal side of things. Likewise, with automobile, if you have a car that is being used for business purposes, but it's also being used for personal purposes, you only add back the personal proportion. So essentially, what proportion of the time is the car being used for personal? Then you add back that amount. Similar thing for cell phones, and this would be the owner's cell phone, but also often owners will have their family's cell phones run through their expenses. So you add back that as well. And then any personal office supplies that were purchased through the business, any renovations, especially if there is like a home office and there was a renovation done, this might apply. And then also ghost employees. So sometimes you'll see MSP owners who have a family member on the books and paying them a salary, but they don't actually do a lot. So that would be another example of an adjustment to make there. One-time expenses. So, we would add back any charitable contributions, bonuses for the owner or for employees. This one, if the exception would be if like there's a bonus for an employee that has been given for several years in a row and the employee is expecting it, then usually the buyer would, want to continue on providing that bonus to keep the employee happy, in which case maybe that wouldn't be a bonus to add back. But for the most part, if it's, kind of non-recurring bonuses for either the owner or the employees, then those would be added back. One-time office renovations, one-time website redesign projects, or any legal bills that are not recurring. These would all be expenses that the buyer wouldn't expect to have in the future, so we can add those back. The adjustment for the owner's salary is a two-step process. So it's only the owner's salary that's shown on the P&L that's added back. We don't do anything about distributions. Those are not added back. And the two steps are first, we subtract what the owner is actually paying themselves, and then we add back the fair market value of to replace their role. And so this should incorporate some factors like how involved is the owner. If they're half time, you only add back half their salary for a replacement, that is. And then how technical is their role. So it would be more expensive to replace like a T3 sort of tech. So if that's what the owner is doing, then you should allocate more to replace the role. And also the cost of labor in the particular market that the MSP is in. And larger cities typically have higher salaries, and so to factor that into so yeah, it's two steps. It's deduct the owner's salary that they're actually paying themselves, then add back what the market rate would be to replace their role. So now I would like to go through an example of a fictional MSP's profit and loss statement. I created these numbers for a little help from ChatGPT, but this is a total fictional example. And I'm just going to switch over to my Excel sheet here. So just give me one moment. Okay, here we go. So here we have XYZ managed service provider. And at the top of the page here, we have our revenues. There's no adjustments here. I did want to make a note, though, that for our fictional MSP here, we have 2.95 million in revenue, of which 1.8 million is for managed services. This is the recurring revenue, which is 61% of the total revenue. And I just wanted to note this because it will come into play later when we're doing our valuation exercise. But as we can see, there's no actual add backs here. So we have revenue of 2.95 million, COGS of 850,000, which means a gross profit of $2.1 million. And as we go down here, we start getting into some expenses, and this was where we'll see some add backs. So we have an automobile expense of 25K, but the owner's personal vehicle expense is $10,000, so that has been added back. We have a cell phone expense of 15K. The owner's cell phone expense themselves is $2,000, and it's used 50% of the time for personal. So that's about $1,000 for the add back. But then they also have their family cell phones at $2,500 per year. So in total, we have $3,500 being added back there. A charitable contribution to the Red Cross of $5,000 is added back in its entirety. We have computer and internet expenses, so we of 20,000, of which 3,000 is added back for the owner's personal PC. Health insurance, so $40,000 for the business in total, of which the owner and their family's health insurance is $6,000. It's important to note here for this one that if the person who'd be brought on to replace the owner's role would also require health insurance, presumably. So in that case, the add back wouldn't necessarily be for the full cost of the owner's health insurance. It would actually be for the difference if the owner has a premium health insurance plan compared to like the cost of a more basic health insurance plan that might be offered to the employee. That's what would be added back. For insurance, so we have 20% of this 50,000 is the owner's personal insurance. So that's 10,000 that we're adding back. We have a $10,000 legal expense, which is legal fees from a former client's lawsuit. So that would be a one-time expense. So we can add that back in its entirety. Then we have $100,000 for marketing and advertising. This would not be added back. This is considered an ongoing expense, that a business expense that the buyer would also have to maintain if they wanted to maintain the business's growth. So that does not get added back at all. Then we have meals and entertainment of 20 grand, of which we're estimating 20% is personal. So we add back $4,000. Then we have an office renovation of 50 grand. This is a one-time expense for a new kitchen in the office. So it's one time, it gets added back in its entirety so that's the 50 grand there. Office supplies of 15 grand. We're assuming about 10% is personal. So we add back $1,500. For pension contribution, we have $100,000 total, of which $60,000 is for the owner's 401k. So we add that 60 grand back. And then here we have a few expenses that are entirely normal business expenses that the buyer would expect to maintain, so they don't get added back. And that is $10,000 for personal services, $6,000 for rent, 15 grand for repairs and maintenance, and then $20,000 for shipping and handling. Then we have wages. So here we have an owner who is paying themselves $275,000 a year. So we add that back, and the rest of the staff's wages stay on the books there. Travel expenses. So $40,000 for travel, of which we're estimating 30% is actually personal. So we add back $12,000 there. 30 grand for utilities doesn't get added back. The buyer would also be expected to maintain those. And then we have a one-time website redesign project here of 15 grand, which gets added back in its entirety. And then we get down to the operating income. This is $490,000. This is not in factoring in any add backs yet. This is just straight out of the P&L. And then we have our non-operating income here. So all four of these categories are for types of income that are not core to the business. We have 10 grand in government grants from wage subsidy that gets added back. We have insurance proceeds of $15,000 from some damage from an office flood that gets added back for 15K. The rent income here for subleasing some office space that also gets added back for 12,000, and then the sale of some assets, some old PCs and old kitchen appliances from that renovation that we talked about, that also gets added back for $4,000. And it's worth noting that because these are income items, that they actually get subtracted versus the add backs, as we'll see here, because we have our total add backs amount here. And this, you can see there's the sum up here of all the expenses which are added back, and then the non-operating income line items get subtracted. So now that we have our net profit and loss, which is just straight out of the P&L, no add backs included. We have the sum of all of our add backs, and also subtracting for the income items that have been adjusted for as well. And then we also have our cost to replace the owner's role. And if we're assuming that this owner is working full time in a CEO position, maybe about $150,000 would be reasonable. That gives us a calculation now where we can calculate the adjusted EBITDA. So we take net profit and loss, we add the total add backs, we subtract the cost to replace the owner's role, and then we come up with a total here of $805,000 adjusted EBITDA. It's worth noting the adjusted EBITDA percentage too. So this is the adjusted EBITDA divided by total revenue. In this case, it's 27%. And this is one of the metrics we will also use for the valuation. So I'm just going to flip back to the PowerPoint for a second here. Okay. So on our website, we do have this tool, which is really handy for valuations. And if you search Google for MSP Valuation Calculator, this will pop up. And it's using the adjusted EBITDA percentage that we just calculated, revenue, and some other basic pieces of information here to help come up with an estimated range. This is just an estimate. If you want to kind of get a bit of a closer idea of what you think what your business might be worth, please feel free to reach out to us. We can talk to you about other factors and can kind of come up with a closer range. But having said that, this valuation calculator is a very good tool, and will give you a rough idea about what the market is paying for MSPs. So I took the actual numbers that we calculated for our fictitious MSP here. So the total yearly revenue, the 27% adjusted EBITDA, the 61% recurring revenue. We're going to assume that we're in a larger market here. So we're a primary market where the population is over 5 million. And then we're going to assume that our revenues year over year are flat. And with those assumptions, let's see what we get in terms of evaluation. So we're coming out with 3.25 million to 3.95 million. So that is going to give you a pretty good idea about what you can expect to receive from offers from buyers. It of course does depend on other factors, as I mentioned, and also depends a lot on the payment terms. But regardless, that is a pretty good estimate about what an MSP with these sort of financials would be worth. I would encourage you to go onto this tool yourself, Google MSP Valuation Calculator. Just try it out. You can enter in your own metrics, calculate your own adjusted EBITDA, put it in there. Try playing around with some of the percentages, see what how the totals change if you, let's say, increase your adjusted EBITDA percentage. And you'll get some interesting numbers and get a good idea about what the market would be willing to pay for your MSP. So I wanted to leave this webinar with some key takeaways for calculating adjusted EBITDA. Adjusted EBITDA, it's important because it's used to determine valuations for MSPs. A multiple of adjusted EBITDA is typically used. Adjustments should be made for any expenses or revenues that the buyer wouldn't inherit. And there's a gray area when it comes to tabulating these, and it's important to be reasonable because the buyers are going to be scrutinizing any add backs, and you want to make sure that you're entering into any sort of a transaction with a buyer where there's mutual respect and mutual credibility. So that's it for the presentation today. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can contact us at info@thehostbroker.com. If you are interested in a free evaluation, go to our website and we have a form that you can click on to get a free evaluation of your MSP. And also, if you're a buyer and you're interested in acquisition opportunities, you can go onto our website to register for our mailing list. And if you're interested in more content about MSP acquisitions or about marketing, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks so much, and until next time.